What if I told you the world has already come terrifyingly close to ending? Not once, not twice, but multiple times. Not in some movie, not in fiction, but in real history. There were moments when humanity stood at the edge of the abyss, moments where a single action, or even a single man's decision, stood between us and complete destruction. Some of these disasters were born of politics. Others were microscopic, invisible. Some were natural, others man-made. But they all share one chilling truth. We survived them by inches. And now, we're counting down the top 10 historical events that almost destroyed the world. This isn't just a list. It's a survival record. Let's begin with two events that brought the entire planet to the brink. 1. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days from global nuclear war, October 1962. The world watched as the United States and the Soviet Union entered a deadly standoff. U.S. spy planes had just photographed Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, only 90 miles from Florida. Those missiles could strike Washington, New York, or Chicago in under 5 minutes. Panic erupted behind closed doors. President John F. Kennedy's advisors pushed for an immediate airstrike. Others warned that would trigger World War III. The U.S. imposed a naval blockade. Soviet ships, carrying more missiles and supplies, moved toward it. The countdown began. But behind the scenes, something even more terrifying was unfolding underwater. A Soviet submarine, B-59, was cruising in the Caribbean, cut off from communication and under intense pressure from U.S. ships dropping depth charges. Its captain believed war had already begun. Inside that submarine was a nuclear torpedo ready to launch. Firing it required unanimous agreement from 3 officers on board. 2 said yes. The third, Vasily Arkhipov, said no. That no is the reason you're alive today. Arkhipov had no proof that war hadn't started, went purely on instinct. If he had agreed, that torpedo would have hit the U.S. fleet, and within minutes, nuclear war would have erupted across the globe. We now know that during those 13 days, the U.S. and Soviet Union came within hours of global annihilation. Bombers were airborne with live nukes. Military alerts were at DEFCON 2, highest ever recorded before war, and tensions were so high that a flock of birds once triggered a false alarm, nearly starting the end by mistake. In the end, diplomacy won. The Soviets agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a secret U.S. promise to remove American missiles from Turkey. But the world had already held its breath, almost never exhaled. 2. The Black Death. The pandemic that almost ended society long before the age of vaccines. Antibiotics and modern medicine, humanity faced a killer it didn't understand and couldn't stop. In 1347, a ship docked in Sicily carrying a deadly cargo, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the Black Death. Within days, people were dying. Within months, cities were collapsing. Over the next 4 years, the plague swept across Europe, Asia, and North Africa like a wildfire. It traveled through fleas on rats, through ships, carts, and trade routes. And wherever it went, it left destruction. By the end, the death toll reached between 75 and 200 million people. In Europe alone, up to 60% of the population died. Entire towns vanished. Fields went unharvested. Famine followed pestilence. Let's be clear, this wasn't just a health crisis. This was a civilizational breakdown. In some regions, there weren't enough people alive to bury the dead. Survivors believed it was the wrath of God. Fanatic groups roamed from city to city, beating themselves with chains to beg for mercy. Others blamed minority communities, sparking violent pogroms and chaos. In London, carts rolled through the streets with the cry, "Bring out your dead." In Paris, plague pits overflowed with corpses. In Florence, it was said you could walk for miles and see only bodies. But here's the part most people forget. Had the plague lasted just a few years longer, or mutated slightly faster, it could have caused a full societal collapse. There were already wars raging. 100 Years' War between England and France was underway. Trade had slowed. Economies were fragile. All it would have taken was one more blow, a bad harvest, a failed government to push everything over the edge, and we weren't prepared. There were no public health systems, no way to trace infections, no organized quarantines at first. The only solution was isolation, prayer, or fleeing. Some scholars believe the plague triggered a kind of reset. Labor shortages eventually gave peasants more power. Feudal systems cracked. But that silver lining came after the near collapse of society. The world didn't recover for nearly 2 centuries. Cities were rebuilt, institutions reformed, medicine advanced. But the Black Death left a scar so deep that it still shapes our history today. These 2 events were vastly different. One was a showdown between superpowers with missiles aimed at each other. The other was a silent, invisible killer with no politics, no ideologies, just death, but both brought the world to the very edge. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, a single Soviet officer stopped the countdown to nuclear winter. In the Black Death, humanity was not saved by wisdom, but by sheer survival. And both remind us that our existence is far more fragile than we care to admit. In Part 2, we'll meet another unlikely hero, a Soviet lieutenant who refused to believe the world was ending, even as alarms screamed nuclear launch. Then we'll go back even further to a supervolcano so massive it nearly wiped out the entire human species before we even got started. You've made it through the first 2, but the next ones? They only get darker. Part 2. A false alarm from the end, and a volcano that nearly ended humanity, so we survived the missiles. We endured the plague, but don't breathe easy yet. Because next up is a moment when the world almost blew itself up. By mistake. And after that, a prehistoric eruption so devastating, scientists believe it reduced humans to just a few thousand survivors. 3. The 1983 Soviet false alarm, the man who saved the world by doing nothing. September 26, 1983, just a few weeks after the Soviet military had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 7, killing over 260 people, including U.S. citizens. The Cold War was boiling. The atmosphere was tense. Soviet leaders were on edge. They feared the U.S. might launch a first strike. That night, Stanislav Petrov, a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, was sitting in a bunker near Moscow, monitoring the early warning systems for signs of a U.S. nuclear attack. Suddenly, alarms blared. The computer system flashed a warning. One U.S. intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched. Then another, then 3 more. According to the system, 5 nuclear missiles were headed straight for the Soviet Union. Petrov had minutes to make a decision. His job was to report the warning to his superiors, who would likely have launched an immediate counterattack triggering full-scale nuclear war. But something didn't feel right. Why only 5 missiles? Why not hundreds? Like a real first strike? Petrov didn't trust the system. He believed it was a malfunction. Against all protocol, he chose not to report the alert. He waited, and he was right. It was a false alarm caused by sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, which the satellite system mistakenly interpreted as missile launches. Petrov's calm, his skepticism, his refusal to blindly follow procedure saved the world. But he paid the price. He was reprimanded for not filling out paperwork correctly. He faded into obscurity. He died in 2017 with few people knowing his name. Let that sink in. One man, alone in a bunker, deciding whether the earth would live or burn. And he chose to wait. 4. The Toba supereruption. The day the sky turned black. Now let's go back, way back. To a time before civilizations, before nations, before history was even written. Roughly 74,000 years ago. On the island of Sumatra, in present-day Indonesia, the earth shuddered. A supervolcano, known as Toba, exploded in what scientists believe was the most powerful volcanic eruption on the planet in the last 2 million years. It ejected more than 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material into the atmosphere. To compare, Mount St. Helens in 1980 ejected just 1 cubic kilometer. Toba was 2,800 times more powerful. The explosion triggered global chaos. Ash clouds darkened the sky around the world. Sulfur particles reflected sunlight away from Earth. Temperatures dropped by up to 10 degrees Celsius globally. A volcanic winter lasting 6 to 10 years followed. Photosynthesis slowed. Crops failed. food chains collapsed, and humanity, we almost didn't make it. Genetic studies suggest that the global human population may have dropped to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals after the eruption. That's not a typo. Humanity was reduced to the size of a small town. That's the kind of number you see on the edge of extinction. Imagine it. Entire lineages died out. Small bands of hunter-gatherers wandered through freezing wastelands. Newborns didn't survive. Tribes vanished. Had the eruption lasted a few more years, or if conditions had been just slightly harsher, humans might have gone the way of the Neanderthals. And what caused it? Just the planet. Being the planet. There was no war, no disease, no politics. Just a volcano flexing its power and nearly wiping out our entire species before we even got started. Today, the Toba caldera remains dormant, but it's still there, still massive, still capable of erupting again. And it's not the only one. Let's stop here and take this in. In the 1980s, we nearly blew ourselves up over a glitch. 74,000 years ago, the Earth almost erased us without even trying. Two stories. One man with a choice. One planet with no mercy. And we made it through both, but barely. In Part 3, we'll step into the shadows of a deadly pandemic that moved faster than any modern disease. Then visit a moment in Middle Eastern history when global superpowers came seconds from a loud nuclear retaliation. The scary part? Those stories happened within the last 100 years. Part 3. The pandemic that moved faster than war, and the day the Middle East nearly triggered a global meltdown. Some disasters unfold slowly. Others move with terrifying speed, faster than bullets, faster than bombs. In this part, we look at two moments that shook the entire globe. One was a virus that circled the world faster than any army. The other, a military conflict that brought nuclear giants to the brink again. 5. The Spanish flu pandemic. When a virus outran modern war, World War I was ending. Soldiers were coming home. The world was ready to celebrate. And then came something no one expected. Not bombs, not bullets, but a virus. It started quietly in a military base in Kansas, of all places. A few soldiers fell sick. No big deal then. It spread. First across America, then Europe, then the entire planet. The Spanish flu, as it came to be called, infected 1/3 of the world's population, roughly 500 million people. But what made it truly terrifying wasn't just how contagious it was who it killed. Most viruses like seasonal flu hit the very old and very young. The Spanish flu killed young, healthy adults in their 20s and 30s. The people who were supposed to survive died in droves. Their immune systems overreacted in what's called a cytokine storm, a violent, self-destructive response that literally tore lungs apart. People would wake up healthy in the morning, die by nightfall. Hospitals overflowed. Doctors collapsed from exhaustion. Cities ran out of coffins. In Philadelphia, bodies were stacked in the streets because there weren't enough grave diggers. In India alone, more than 12 million people died. In the U.S., over 675,000. Globally, at least 50 million, with some estimates as high as 100 million. To put that in perspective, that's more than all military and civilian deaths in both world wars combined. And here's the worst part. It happened at a time when communication was limited. Vaccines didn't exist, and basic understanding of viruses was still primitive. The only defense? Quarantines, face masks, social distancing. Sound familiar? Historians agree. Had the virus mutated just slightly to spread even faster, or killed at an even higher rate, it could have derailed global recovery. After World War I perhaps even sparked revolutions, economic collapses, and political chaos on a scale we've never seen. Some governments, like the German Empire, were so weakened by the virus that it likely accelerated their defeat in WWI. And the societal fatigue it caused created the perfect storm for the rise of extremist ideologies later. It wasn't just a flu. It was a pandemic that shook the very foundation of the modern world. And even today, the exact origin and behavior of the virus remain partly mysterious. 100 years later, we're still learning its lessons. 6. The Yom Kippur War, when nuclear war almost spilled from the Middle East. It was October 6, 1973. Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. While most of Israel was fasting or praying, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack. It was the beginning of the Yom Kippur War, a brutal, fast-moving conflict that would last for less than 3 weeks, but almost ignited a global nuclear catastrophe. In the early days, Israeli forces were overwhelmed. The borders were crumbling. Israeli leaders feared the worst. Here's where things get chilling. Facing potential collapse, Israel readied its nuclear weapons. According to declassified sources, they began assembling warheads and positioning them for possible use, not just as defense, but as a signal to the U.S. And the signal worked. The United States, realizing how serious the situation was, launched a massive resupply operation, airlifting weapons, ammunition, and equipment to Israeli forces. The Soviets, backing Egypt and Syria, responded by threatening to intervene militarily if Israel advanced further. The U.S. went on nuclear alert DEFCON 3. American strategic bombers were placed on standby. Troops were mobilized. Submarines were repositioned. For a moment, the Yom Kippur War was no longer just a regional fight. It was the trigger point of another Cold War face-off, with 2 nuclear giants once again eyeing the red button. And unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, this time it wasn't a standalone standoff. It was a proxy war, entangled in religious tension, territorial disputes, oil politics, and decades of violence. It wasn't clear who was bluffing. It didn't take much for bluffing to become launching. Eventually, diplomacy held. A ceasefire was negotiated. The superpowers pulled back. The war ended. But the near miss was dangerously close. Military historians often say, if Israel had used even one tactical nuclear weapon, the Soviets would have responded. And from there, there was no going back. That's how quickly global politics can spiral into global extinction. The Spanish flu moved so fast and so fatally, it nearly broke the post-war world. The Yom Kippur War, with its mix of faith, fear, and firepower, almost lit a nuclear chain reaction from the Middle East to Moscow to Washington. It's 2 very different threats. One invisible, one political, both nearly unstoppable. In Part 4, we'll turn to 2 catastrophes of a very different kind. One was a power plant explosion that sent radioactive poison across a continent. The other, a modern pandemic UVA definitely lived through one that shattered economies and exposed just how vulnerable we still are. The past isn't done with us. And the worst, sometimes. The danger comes from our own inventions. Part 4. Poison in the wind. In a virus that froze the world, we've seen wars almost go nuclear. We've seen viruses tear through continents. But what happens when the danger doesn't explode, but leaks? In this part, we explore 2 events from the modern age. 1. A catastrophic nuclear meltdown that poisoned a continent. The other, a pandemic you lived through which nearly collapsed the entire global system. 7. The Chernobyl disaster when the air became deadly, April 26, 1986. At 1:23 a.m. in a reactor building deep inside the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine. Engineers began a late-night test. It was supposed to be routine. Instead, it triggered the worst nuclear disaster in human history. Reactor 4 exploded violently. The core, containing over 180 tons of radioactive uranium, was exposed to the open air. The force of the blast blew the roof off the building. A radioactive cloud rose into the sky and began drifting over Belarus, Russia, Poland, Sweden, and eventually most of Europe. Firefighters arrived within minutes. They had no protective gear. They walked directly into lethal radiation. Some died within hours. Others suffered horrifying symptoms over weeks. Soviet authorities at first denied everything. It was until a nuclear plant in Sweden detected unusual radiation levels that the world realized something was terribly wrong. By the time the truth came out, it was already too late. Over 350,000 people were evacuated. The nearby city of Pripyat, once home to 50,000, became a ghost town overnight. The long-term health impacts, still debated. But estimates suggest up to 4,000 to 90,000 premature deaths due to radiation exposure. And the worst part? Chernobyl could have been far worse. If the other three reactors had also exploded, as was feared during the crisis, it might have rendered all of Eastern Europe uninhabitable for decades. There were even contingency plans to evacuate Kyiv and Minsk, major cities with millions of people. A massive concrete structure, the sarcophagus, was eventually built to seal the reactor. But even today, radiation leaks are being monitored. The threat isn't over, it's just sleeping. Chernobyl taught us a lesson. You don't need war or weapons to unleash destruction. Sometimes, it's the systems we build that turn against us. 8. The COVID-19 pandemic. When the world hit pause. We don't need to imagine this one. We were there. We're still there. Late 2019, a cluster of pneumonia cases in Wuhan, China, linked to a novel coronavirus. By January 2020, it had crossed borders. By March, it had crossed oceans. The entire world shut down. Borders closed. Flights grounded. Cities emptied. For the first time in living memory, humanity collectively paused. Hospitals overflowed. Doctors and nurses worked shifts that seemed endless. Ventilators became precious. So did masks. So did hope. The numbers were staggering. Over 700 million cases globally, more than 7 million deaths, with excess mortality still debated. Entire industries collapsed. Mental health spiraled. Education halted. Travel gone. What began as a health crisis quickly mutated into a global systems collapse. Supply chains broke down. Supermarkets ran out of toilet paper. Medical workers wore trash bags as protection. People stood on balconies, clapping for healthcare heroes, while funerals were held over video calls. And the economic toll? Historic. The World Bank declared it the worst global recession since World War II. Airlines grounded. Restaurants shuttered. Cities silenced. But the scarier part, we weren't ready. Despite our technology, our global institutions, our satellites and AI, we were caught flat-footed. And it could have been even worse. What if COVID had a higher fatality rate, like MERS or Ebola? What if it mutated faster? What if vaccines took longer? We were lucky. Not because the virus was mild, but because it wasn't worse. It exposed just how fragile our stable world truly is. No bombs were dropped. No armies marched. But COVID brought nations to their knees. It wasn't just a medical event. It was a mirror showing us how interconnected, unprepared, and vulnerable we really are. These two events, Chernobyl and COVID-19, ancient history, they happened in our lifetimes. And both proved something chilling. You don't need war to end the world. You just need human error or nature to light the fuse. A faulty test at a nuclear plant, a virus-jumping species, and suddenly... In Part 5, we conclude with the final two entries on our list. One is a doomsday system built by design, programmed to launch without human input. The other is a financial crash that nearly dismantled modern civilization, not with violence but with debt. They're terrifying because they show that sometimes we build our own doom. Part 5. The machine that could end us, and the collapse that almost did. We've survived close calls with nuclear war. We've crawled through pandemics, through volcanic winters, through deadly mistakes. But what if the most terrifying threat wasn't war, disease, or natural disaster, but something we built ourselves, something designed to destroy even when no one is left alive to give the order? Let us talk about the machine that could have ended humanity automatically, and the financial chain reaction that almost did. 9. The Cold War doomsday machines. When no one needed to be alive to end the world during the Cold War. The world's superpowers weren't just building missiles, they were building fail-safes. But these fail-safes weren't really safe at all. They were automated doomsday systems, the most infamous. A Soviet system called Dead Hand, or Perimeter. It was built to guarantee retaliation. If Moscow was destroyed, if Soviet leadership was wiped out, the system would detect it via seismic sensors, radiation levels, loss of communications, and then, without needing a single human command, it would automatically launch nuclear missiles at the United States and its allies. Think about that. A machine programmed to start World War III after everyone is already dead. Even worse, some reports suggest that if the system lost contact with military leadership for too long, It would assume the worst and fire. It was built to be paranoid, to act without doubt, to destroy, not to ask questions. The United States didn't have an exact equivalent, but came dangerously close with its own launch and warning protocols, where missiles could be launched based on radar detection before enemy missiles even landed. In other words, a false alarm like the one that nearly triggered disaster in 1983 could have launched the end of the world automatically. These machines weren't just terrifying because of what they could do. They were terrifying because they were designed to remove human hesitation. Logic circuits replaced judgment.
Algorithms
Replaced diplomacy. And what's most chilling? Many experts believe Russia's dead-hand systems still exist, possibly modernized, possibly updated with artificial intelligence. Even now, the world lives under the shadow of a machine designed to unleash the apocalypse, and we built it ourselves. 10. The 2008 global financial crisis, when the world almost collapsed without a war. Now let's turn from missiles to money, because in 2008, the world came closer to complete collapse than most people realize, and not because of war or disease or disaster, but because of math, debt, and blind trust in a broken system. It started with the housing market in the United States. Banks had been handing out risky home loan subprime mortgages to people who couldn't afford them. These were bundled into financial products sold around the world, insured with complex instruments that no one fully understood. In 2007, cracks began to show. By 2008, the house of cards collapsed. Lehman Brothers, one of the biggest investment banks, declared bankruptcy. AIG, a massive insurance firm, teetered on the edge. Credit froze. Stock markets crashed. Banks stopped lending, even to each other. And suddenly, the entire global financial system stood still. People couldn't access their savings. Payrolls missed. Businesses closed. Millions lost their homes. In the U.S. alone, over 8.7 million jobs vanished. Globally, $20 trillion evaporated. Panic spread faster than any virus. And here's the terrifying part. This wasn't caused by an outside force. It was entirely man-made. The crisis revealed just how fragile our interconnected economies really are. Just how quickly the collapse of one institution can trigger a global cascade. If governments hadn't intervened, if central banks hadn't injected trillions in emergency bailouts, the entire system might have collapsed. Credit cards would have stopped working. ATMs would have run dry. Supermarket shelves could have gone empty. Cities could have rioted. Economies could have fallen like dominoes. And it all started with numbers on a screen. Former Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke later admitted, "We came very close to a global financial meltdown. If we hadn't acted, the system might have collapsed entirely. In a way, we dodged the bullet, but only barely. And the worst part? The underlying systems. The debt. The risk. The speed still exists today. The machine hasn't stopped. It's just spinning quietly. So let's take a breath." We've now explored 10 moments where the world teetered on the edge. From volcanic supereruptions to invisible pandemics. From nuclear standoffs to algorithmic apocalypse. What connects them isn't just the scale of the danger. It's how close we came, and how often it was just one person, one moment of luck, or one decision that pulled us back from the brink. A Soviet officer who said no. A lieutenant who didn't report a false alarm. A pandemic that didn't mutate further. A bailout that barely held. We like to think the world is solid, that civilization is permanent. That the systems we rely on, governments, markets, medicine, machines, will always protect us. But history says otherwise. History says we've been incredibly, terrifyingly lucky, and maybe it's time we stopped relying on luck. If you found this video mind-blowing, hit that like button to help more people discover it. Share it with friends who love history and near-apocalyptic stories. They might not believe how close we've come. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another countdown that could change how you see the world. Want to support the channel directly? Hit that super thanks button below. Every bit helps us keep digging up the wildest stories from history. See you in the next one, if the world doesn't end first.